My name is Dane Smith, and I am a managing director for FSG in our Washington, D.C. office. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with you all today. A couple of years ago, Mark Kramer and I were in Brazil for the Rio Plus 20 events. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to visit a wonderful shared value project. So Pedro Massa from Coca-Cola, who's here with us today, took us out to one of the favelas in Rio, one of the shanty towns in Rio. And he took us to visit the Coletivo program. Now, Coletivo is a job training and life skills training program in the favelas. When we were there, we had an opportunity to meet a young woman. Her name is Aline. Aline is 21 years old. And like many of the youth that live in the favelas, she came from a very challenging background. Her father had been a victim in the drug trafficking conflict. She herself had a scar on her leg from a bullet wound. She was someone who, like many of the youth in the favela, she didn't have a lot of life opportunities. She didn't have a lot of career opportunities. But Aline was able to tell Mark and me about how her life had been transformed in a way through this Coletivo program. She had been through the program. She had learned about merchandising skills and retailing skills. She'd learned life skills about how to develop a career. And Aline was quite eloquent in her gentle way as she told us a little bit about this experience. She said, Coletivo really showed me what was possible. It taught me concrete skills so that I could work in a store, so I could know how to do retailing. But it also taught me about life. It really helped me believe in myself in a way that I hadn't believed in myself before. Mark and I were extremely impressed by this example of Coletivo. Not just because it was having profound social impact on the lives of so many youth, now tens of thousands of youth across Brazil, but because of the way that it was structured, because Coletivo is a wonderful example of shared value. It's not just philanthropy, it's not just corporate social responsibility, but the way that Coletivo fortifies Coca-Cola's cluster, the way it strengthens its customers, the way that it strengthens its business in a particular part of the Brazilian market, means that it creates business results for Coca-Cola and results that cause Coca-Cola to continue to look for ways to extend and expand the impact of this program. Our next speaker, Brian Smith, was the leader in Brazil when Coletivo was launched. It was Brian who first had the idea that Brazil could tackle one of its big business challenges, one of its big business opportunities, by trying to resolve a social problem. And this is a profound difference, and this is an example now that has some 6 or 7 years of track record and impact behind it. And Brian's going to share a little bit about that experience with you today. Brian was the president of Coca-Cola Brazil from 2002 to 2008. Then he moved to be leader of the Mexican Brazil, the business unit from 2008 to 2011. And the last several years, he's been the head of the Latin America region for Coca-Cola. Brian Smith, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I won't take credit for the idea because it wasn't mine. It was actually Pedro's and Claudia's, his boss in Brazil, that came up with the idea of doing the Coletivo. I was there and I was able to give them the room to be able to do that project. But the idea came from them, and you know, the way it came about was we had an issue with how to tap into the emerging middle class and the lower classes in Brazil, which is huge. It's a huge part of our consumer base in Brazil. And also how we actually could deliver our products to them in the favelas. There were problems, on the one hand, security reasons, that we couldn't actually have our bottlers' trucks in a lot of cases go in there. And then secondly, even if they could, the point is that there wasn't enough business for them to have drop size that made it efficient for us to be in there. So that business need, both connecting to that group. Now, we could have connected to that group through the way we do it in a lot of ways, which is, you know, just commercials and advertising and all those kinds of things. But the idea from Claudia and Pedro was, how can we connect with them in a way that's different than the way we've done it traditionally? And how can we immerse ourselves in their reality in such a way that we connect with them emotionally, like we would try to do through a regular communication campaign, but at the same time help to build our business in those communities from which they come. And so that's how the idea came up. The way we work in Coke is we sell concentrate to bottlers. Bottlers mix the concentrate with water and sugar and so on, and then they make the final product. They distribute the product, they sell the product. And so we had to do it with our bottlers because we're a franchise system around the world. And so we had two bottlers, one in Sao Paulo and one in Recife, in the north east of Brazil, who were willing to do this. So we opened 5 Coletivos within favelas in community centers that were already built. And we started the program, which was Coletivo Retail, which was to train youth. At that point, and now, actually, 20% of youth in Brazil is unemployed, they're not in schools, and they're not being trained. So they're doing doing nothing. And so we started those 5 centers to train them to be able to have the skills to work in retail, with the idea that they could eventually then work in some of our clients like McDonald's or Walmart or Subway, and or in some of the small stores that were in the favelas, either one. And it sounds easy, you know, you just grab them and you train them and then they go and they start working and stuff. But the biggest problem we found was the self-esteem. I mean, these are youth that in a lot of cases would come in and just didn't, we could do all the training and then they'd go to job interviews, or they didn't go to the job interviews because they were too scared to go to the job interview, or they went to the job interview, they got the job, and a month later they quit because they didn't have the skills to be able to feel worthwhile to be able to do that thing. And so we realized that we had to have a big part of our training, which was to build their self-esteem, so that they felt that not only they could do it, but they had the potential to go beyond that. And unless we had done that, what we've done today would not have been successful. And what we found is that we've pretty much been able to build their self-esteem by 20%. You're going, 20? How does he know they've built, you know, self-esteem by 20%? We actually measure it. We actually have ways to measure that when they come in and after they've been trained and have taken jobs. And so all of this is done with metrics, whether it's business metrics or training metrics or whatever metrics you want, so that we know what's going on, both psychologically and in terms of their ability to do things. And to the extent that we build their self-love, what we found is that the brand equity, or what we call in Coke the brand love for our brands, for brand Coca-Cola, in those communities goes up as well. So, you know, there's a direct correlation between self-esteem in those communities, or those people we work with, and how much they value our brand. And so it's a virtuous circle from that perspective, and that's probably the biggest thing that we're able to accomplish from a business side, is to build our equity, which may not have results in the immediate short term, but in the long term, over the lifespan, of those consumers has a huge impact on our revenues and our profitability. One example of, even before we got into Coletivos, we had been doing recycling cooperatives throughout Brazil to collect and to recycle bottles, all kinds of waste actually. And so we build these cooperatives. Now, one of the colectivos we have is recycling. But I remember a testimonial from one of the people that worked in the colectivo, I think it was in Sao Paulo, and he came up and he's on the stage and he was talking to us, all the employees at the company. He said, you know, this is a great program. And people were asking him why, because you're recycling and you're doing something good. And he said, no, well, yes. But the main thing is because I'm a product of the cooperative. And we said, well, why? And he said, because I'm recycled. I was homeless. I had no job. I was on the streets. I'd been on the streets for 2 years. I was worthless. I had no dignity. I had no self-esteem. And now I'm here. I have a job. I can care for my family. And I've found hope again in my life. And I think that really characterizes a lot of what we're able to do through the Coletivo program. But he was older, at a much younger age, so that the potential that these kids have can be spurred on to getting them to do as much as they can. So the idea is not to have them stuck in retail necessarily doing a retail job. The idea is how far can they go? This is just the first step along, you know, hopefully a successful career for them. So now we have 500 of these in Brazil. We've actually trained 70,000 youth in Brazil. We have 7 different types of colectivos. We have the retail, which I mentioned. We have recycling. We have entrepreneurship, where we teach kids how to build businesses. We have logistics, which is to help train them to work in distribution and the whole supply chain part of either our business or other businesses. Events. There's a lot of events, music and sports and so on, to train them to be people that work in events in Brazil. The forest, which is actually going into the Amazon. This is a really cool one. We go into the Amazon and we train. We actually set up the logistics for them to be able to pick specific acai berries, which is a berry in the Amazon. They couldn't bring it to commercialize it because it has to be refrigerated and frozen within 24 hours, and so they couldn't do that. So we set up a network so that they could actually do that, and we're now training them to be able to collect and get income from that so that they don't have to cut down the trees, which is what they used to do to be able to get income to survive, because they weren't making enough from what they could do in farming. And then arts. We're also training kids to do a lot of art and crafts by using recycled materials. So what are the results? 500 communities, 7 different types of Coletivo programs. 30% of the graduates get jobs. And once they get the jobs and they get income, that reinforces the self-esteem, and it kind of just builds from there. 20% increase in self-esteem. 70% of the youth that are in these programs are girls, women. And so that ties into our 5x20 program. Coca-Cola has a program that we will empower 5 million women by 2020 to be self-sufficient in jobs and to generate their own income. So this ties perfectly into that overall challenge that our chairman has set for us on a worldwide basis. The business is up 6%. So you could go, 6%, meh, so what? The point is that 6% is enough to pay for this. 6% increase in volume for us and for our bottlers pays for what we're investing in the program. So it's scalable, it's sustainable, and we can make it bigger. That's why we've gotten to 500 centers at this point. As I said before, brand love is a big, important part of this for us. And then employee engagement. Our employees absolutely love the fact that we're doing all this stuff, and they get involved directly in those cities where there are the colectivos to work with them on a volunteer basis or to work on even cross-functional teams that work in continuing to build this. The learning is, and I have no more time, but let me just say it quickly, build on your strengths. So in our case, we understand how to be, first of all, we know how to work with people. One of the strengths of Coca-Cola is building relationships with our bottlers. It's a franchise system, so if we can't get along with our bottlers, we're dead. And so the point is that ability to get together with our bottlers, to get together with the communities, with the NGOs in the communities, because each of these programs has an NGO that's embedded in it, that's working with us to do this, makes it much better for us. And we're building on our strengths. Weaving ourselves into the texture of the communities. Partnerships, again, NGO, the government, the ministries, different ministries in Brazil are involved in this with us. A systematized approach, so, do it like a business. You know what your objectives are and track it and make sure that you're in fact achieving both the business objective, but also the objective that you've set for yourself in terms of the community and the people. Do it for the right reasons, so be authentic. Experiment. One of the reasons I think it worked is because they had free rein to find the path. We weren't sure exactly where this was going to end up, but the fact that they had the time and the resources to be able to find the path, I think made a big difference. And I would say lead from below. It's very hard to institute this from the top. If corporate had said, okay, go do this, the chances of success would be pretty much nil. So what corporate can do is set a target, or they can give resources, or they can give the space. But I think that these programs have to grow from the bottom, from business units upwards. And now what we're trying to do, what we're actually doing, is we're scaling it to other countries. So we're taking it from Brazil to other countries with the help of the Interdevelopment Bank. We're also linked into UN Women because of all the work that we're doing, again, for the 5x20 program. And we're working with FSG to be able to design a strategy where we're not only doing the colectivos, but where we can find other areas of shared value that we can build going forward, not only in Brazil, but in Latin America and eventually globally. So with that, I think we can take some questions. Yeah, we're going to open up to questions from the audience, but I'm going to use my privilege of being up here to start with the first question. Brian, I know from the work that we're doing together in Brazil that one of the most powerful dynamics of this entire program is that virtuous cycle that you described. So throughout the Coletivo programs, whether it's Coletivo Retail, where you are strengthening your customers, which drives your business, or Coletivo Recycling, which is actually a means of lowering your cost of production over the long term, or Coletivo Florist, where you're talking about strengthening your supply chain for new products that you're introducing. One of the reasons why you've been able to have the space to really learn and scale this to increase the impact is because you're having business results that then cause you to deepen your investment and continue to look for ways of innovating. Can you talk a little bit more about that virtuous cycle, how that works, and then how you're thinking about extending that through the region? Yeah. Well, it's pretty much what you just said. In the case of retail, we get employees in our supply chain. In the forest, we get fruit that we're actually putting into our products that we're selling in Brazil. And eventually, when we get enough, we'll probably take it to other parts of the world. In the case of logistics, again, it's working in our supply chain. So there's a benefit from that perspective. There's a benefit from the perspective of increasing our volume sales in the communities that we're touching, which is generating more profit. And there's a value of building brand equity for our brand, because and that type of brand equity is probably worth a lot more if you had to qualify it than a brand equity that you could create through, say, an advertising campaign, because you're actually changing people's lives, and they remember that, consciously or unconsciously, that you were a part of their lives at a certain point and how it affects them, their families, and the communities around them. So it's clearly a virtuous cycle. And I think you always have to ask yourself the question that it continues to be so, because to the extent that it stops being that way is to the extent that a company like ours probably could drop it, because it ends up being, people don't see the reason to do it anymore. And we've done some great things in Brazil that were great projects, to put it that way, but they were more philanthropy. And eventually it got to a point where we couldn't sustain them anymore. And so we dropped them. In fact, one of the projects we did with the government of President Lula was soup kitchens, Prato Popular, and we built it up to like 30 with our bottlers. But once he left, then the enthusiasm from the government left, and we realized that we were in the process of beginning to scale it to the same kind of thing like the Coletivo, using it as a community center to do all these other things. But once we lost the support from the government, what we did is we kind of transitioned all the efforts we were doing there into the Coletivo project.
Great. Do we have questions from the audience? We've got mics set up a few places around the room, so please take advantage of the opportunities to ask questions. Go ahead.
Hi. Pam Bolton with CMMB, an NGO that's very bought into the notions of shared value and collective impact. Two questions. One is, I know that Coca-Cola has a history, maybe an old history, but in Brazil, of trying to create beverages that were more nutritious and also could find a market. So I'm interested to know, you talked about acai, are there any other efforts along those lines? And secondly, 30% employment, not too high. Are there moves that you have to increase that? Because I imagine that self-esteem gains are transient if people don't have some reinforcement.
Yeah. Well, first question. Our palette for Coca-Cola is everything that's not alcoholic. So it goes everywhere from soft drinks to water to juices to dairy products. And the idea is, from that perspective, it's a business thing, right? What do consumers want? And we will follow consumer trends, and to the extent that we can push those consumer trends, we'll take advantage of them. And in this case, the fact that we can get fruit from the Amazon to protect the Amazon that we can put into our products is a huge plus, from no matter how you want to look at it. And so I would say that we're going to continue to do that, and we're going to continue to do it in other kinds of categories, not just fruit. And so, for instance, we have a project right now in Mexico where we're helping coffee growers in Chiapas with the Howard Buffett Foundation. And essentially what we're doing, they've lost half of their crops because of a leaf disease. So what we're doing is we're doing the same thing. We're training in terms of what they should be planting, how they should plant it, how they should take care of it, how they should sell it, blah, 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 so that they can increase their crop again, and we can build, through that, we'll build that link to that community. They go 2 or 3 months without eating very much because that's the period when they don't have any revenue. So the idea is to create more revenue that then will balance over the year for these people because they're very, very poor. So that's another example. And the second question is, it's a good pushback. I mean, how do we do that? You're right. I mean, it would be great if it was 70% or 80%. So we're always looking for ways that we can, and one of the ways we're trying to do is by increasing, not just having retail, having arts, having, events, so that we cater to different, because, somebody could be trained to do retail, but it's not what I want to do. But if they're artistic, then that could be another avenue. So the idea is we're trying to create these programs in such a way that we can capture most of the aspirations that would be coming from people from those communities. And the events, for instance, is a great one because, teenagers are linked to music and they're linked to sports and everything else. And we are very tied to those things. We have big venues. So for instance, for the World Cup now, being sponsors, we're training a lot of these youth that are interested in the events to be working at the World Cup in the stadiums during the games.
Another question.
Yeah, Susan Ray Ross. Thanks, it's a great program. I'm wondering if you could talk about where the funding comes from, because oftentimes companies, even when they're doing a big initiatives, the funding still comes out of the foundation. And if this is really something that is going to be baked into the business unit. I think it would be really useful to know if the funding is coming out of the business unit versus out of the foundation.
That's a really good question. And I wish I could answer it, black and white, but it isn't that way. So typically, in fact, I don't even know, Pedro, is it being funded out of the foundation today, or is it being funded out of the division? From the business. So it's being funded out of the business. Now, we have cases and other times where it gets funded out of the foundation, and then it starts in the business and it goes to the foundation and vice versa. And so what we've tried to do is put a line and have the foundation only do, because we have Coca-Cola foundations in different countries, only do those things that are in some ways less linked directly to the business. So they end up being in some ways maybe more philanthropy in some ways, or maybe longer term. In Mexico, for instance, we're doing big projects right now with funding universities for diabetes research. It has nothing to do directly with our business today. And it's something that would be harder to fund from business, but you can fund it from the foundation knowing that the results will be 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And specifically in Mexico, the genome, the genetic makeup of Mexicans, and why they have a propensity for diabetes, for obesity, for all these other things, so that we end up being part of the solution of what's going on there. And so, again, it's not a clean answer, but that's the way we've kind of tried to do it. Now, when you think about shared value, you could say, well, heck, theoretically, it all touches the business, whether it's short-term or long-term, so it shouldn't make that much of a difference. But the important thing is really to find the funding. In a big company, as long as you could find it somewhere, just grab it, put it in, and get it going, and then eventually you have to go and look for more. But then when you get people from the outside also funding because they know that you're doing some good stuff, like IDB and or other organizations, then you can really scale it. Not only in a country, but worldwide. I mean, big, big. And if we do things as Coke that are small, it doesn't make a material difference. So we got to do things that end up being very scalable. Mm-hmm.
Another question.
Fantastic to hear how you've scaled this up within Brazil, and now you're taking it beyond Brazil. You just touched on the issue of scalability. The other dimension of scalability is not just the external initiatives that you're doing and how to take them to scale, but in a big, complex organization like Coca-Cola, and indeed Novartis, where I work, there's the other dimension, which is the internal one. How do you drive scalability and traction of an agenda like shared value within your organization? You're from the general management cadre. Maybe you can talk about how that can be given greater momentum within your organization.
Yeah, another great question. The way it's worked in Coke, and I don't know how it works in other places, but that's why I was saying before, I think it needs to be seeded from the bottom up, right? Because otherwise it's kind of tough. Now, there has to be at the top, at corporate, this willingness to move into that space. So our chairman is very vocal about a number of programs, 5 by 20, which is empowering 5 million women by 2020, being water neutral, package neutral, carbon neutral, everything neutral, essentially, between now and 2020. So theoretically, by 2020, the Coca-Cola company, in its system and its bottlers, will not leave any tracks on the earth, right? So when you have those as objectives that we have to bake into our business plans, then at least you know that you're being tracked in terms of that, then you start to have an incentive to start getting traction there. And then what happens is we have people at corporate. B. Perez is somewhere around, there she is. And she's in charge of taking these that are successful, like Coletivo, and eventually taking it around the rest of the world, right? So from Brazil, it can go, it's on the process of going to some other countries in Latin America, and probably will flip over to Africa, because the group president in Africa has huge enthusiasm for Coletivo. And then from there, it'll go to other places. But I think you can't mandate it. I think you need to look for people within the company that buy into it and really believe in it and have passion for it. And once you have that, they can always find the resources to be able to build it and to scale it. And having learned how to do it in other places, then the job of corporate is to charter and to transfer those learnings so that they don't make the same mistakes.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. Appreciate it. That's all the time we have for questions.
You're welcome. Thank you.